On August 1st, 1981, MTV was launched, and the concept of a TV channel playing music videos 24/7 was seen as the dawn of a new era. But for many black musicians, this new platform was simply unavailable to them, and David Bowie, superstar, decided to call out what he saw as racism. The common narrative that MTV was racist in the 80s is maybe a bit too harsh, or at the very least doesn't explain the entire situation. And a good example of this is what happened to Rick James. In the early 80s, James was arguably the most prominent contemporary black musician in the world and was trying to stay relevant by appearing on MTV. So he got his record label Motown to allocate a six-figure budget for music videos, which were made for his 1981 singles, Give It To Me Baby and Super Freak. These songs were major hits, but were seemingly absent from MTV's 24-hour schedule. Eventually, Rick James could not hold his tongue for much longer and called them out for not playing black artists. He said, "MTV don't play Rick James, they don't play Michael Jackson, they don't play the Commodores, they don't play Earth, Wind and Fire, they don't play Stevie Wonder. Why is that?" He would add, "We're being sat in the back of the bus television style. This isn't the Wizard of Oz. There are black people here, and we make music." Rick James found himself isolated by these comments. MTV was becoming a powerful force, and it would be unwise for other artists to criticize or boycott them. He told ABC's Nightline, "I'm a crusader without an army. All these black artists claim they're behind me, but when it's time to make a public statement, you can't find them. They're going to let me do all the rapping and get into trouble, and then they'll reap the benefits." MTV's response to this was that James was not playing the type of music that fit their channel. Bob Pittman, founder of MTV, said, "Rick James is great, so is Parliament Funkadelic. But we turned down Rick James because the consumer didn't define him as rock. But we do play black artists, Joan Armatrading, Gary U.S. Bonds, and Jimi Hendrix, because they fit in with rock and roll. So it has nothing to do with race, but with sound." MTV was doing something called narrowcasting. Major TV stations like ABC, NBC, etc. are broadcasters who are trying to reach the broadest audience possible. MTV was a cable channel that was narrowcasting to hone in on a very niche audience, and having a narrow and niche audience is something that advertisers would pay a lot of money to reach. So MTV was marketing itself as a rock station, and as I'll get into later on, there are problems and inconsistencies with this model. But going back to Rick James, it later emerged that there was another reason why Super Freak wasn't played on MTV. The video was actually vetoed by one of MTV's founders, Carolyn Baker, who said, "It wasn't MTV that turned down Super Freak, it was me. I turned it down. You know why? Because there were half-naked women in it, and it was a piece of crap. As a black woman, I did not want that representing my people as the first black video on MTV." But even her statement implied that there were little or no black musicians on MTV, and the channel's narrowcasting model disproportionately affected black artists. And MTV was where all of the money was at the time. The only alternative TV station was BET, but this only had 1/5 of the viewers that MTV had. By 1983, David Bowie was trying to promote his song Let's Dance. The song was produced by disco legend Nile Rodgers from the band Chic, and while they had become friends, Rodgers basically explained to Bowie the difficulties of being a black artist during this time. Initially, Bowie was oblivious to their struggle. Rodgers recalled working with him, and Bowie told him, "I just think about what I'm feeling and what I'm seeing. I never worry about which audience is going to like it." Rodgers recalls hearing this statement and thinking, "Geez, it must be amazing to be white." But eventually Rodgers had explained to him how things were different. Rodgers said, "I remember once explaining to him how, for me as a black artist, it was very difficult for me to get hits because we had fewer radio stations to expose our music. So to get attention, a technique of mine was I always started my songs with the chorus, 'Ah, freak out,' and 'We Are Family,' and then of course there's 'Let's Dance.' While Bowie is best known for rock music, Let's Dance is essentially a disco song, and Nile Rodgers' fingerprints are all over it. So you can probably imagine Bowie had a sense of guilt or frustration that he was being interviewed on MTV, whereas they might have not done the same had the song been performed by Nile Rodgers and Chic. On top of that, MTV were also playing music by Hall & Oates, who were making R&B and soul music, but were somehow being played on MTV's narrowcasting model, and just so happened to be white. Bowie was interviewed by Mark Goodman, a popular DJ for the channel. What starts off as a friendly music interview turned into something different. Bowie decides to ask some questions of his own, and the friendly conversation escalates into an interrogation. Interestingly, Bowie does not simply call them out for being racist or get aggressive. Instead, he behaves like an attorney cross-examining a witness in court and waits for him to say something damning and trip over his own words. Bowie asks, "It occurred to me, having watched MTV over the last few months, that it's a solid enterprise. Really, it's got a lot going for it. I'm just floored by the fact that there are so few black artists featured on it. Why is that?" Goodman is basically put in an awkward situation where he has to defend his employers and doesn't seem to disagree with Bowie. He says, "I think we're trying to move in that direction. We want to play artists that seem to be doing music that fits into what we want to play for MTV. The company is thinking in terms of narrowcasting." And his reframing of it as narrowcasting gets jumped on by Bowie. He says, "That's evident. It's evident in the fact that the only few black artists that one does see are on about 2:30 in the morning to around 6. Very few are featured predominantly during the day. I'll say that over the last couple of weeks, these things have been changing, but it's a slow process." And this is where Goodman actually pushed back. He says, "I think people have different perceptions when you wind up watching. Let's say watch an hour or 2 or even 3 a day, people somehow come away with different ideas about what we are doing. We don't have any kind of day parting for anything, let alone a black artist day parted out of what would be, quote, prime time. We don't have that." At this stage, Goodman is probably doing an okay job at protecting the MTV brand, but what happens next is when things get pretty revealing. Bowie says there are TV stations that are promoting black musicians, and they're making some great videos too, so he's surprised that they aren't being played on MTV. And then things take a darker turn. Goodman says, "Of course. Also, we have to try and do what we think not only New York and Los Angeles will appreciate, but also Poughkeepsie or Midwest. Pick some town in the Midwest that would be scared to death by Prince, which we're playing, or a string of other black faces and black music." Bowie's rightfully dumbfounded by the term black faces and says, "That's very interesting." There was a lot of moral panic about Prince during this time, but this was partially because of his overly sexual lyrics and how flamboyantly he dressed. But Goodman seems to contend that Prince being black was an issue for his audience, and the great irony is that Prince was actually from Minneapolis in the Midwest. The car crash interview continues, and Goodman continued saying things that MTV probably didn't want their audience to know or hear. Goodman takes the example of the Isley Brothers, a black funk and R&B group who were prominent in the 70s. He says, "Now, the question would be asked, since we're in New York, should WPLJ play, the Isley Brothers? Well, you and I might say, well, yeah, because we've grown up in an era when the Isley Brothers mean something to me. And so do the Spinners way after the Isley Brothers. But what does it mean to a 17-year-old? Well, when you talk on the phone to these guys like I did when I was in radio, it's scary." And Bowie decided to cut him off at this point. What he means by, quote, 17-year-old is a white 17-year-old kid. Bowie says, "Well, I tell you what it means. I tell you what maybe the Isley Brothers or Marvin Gaye means to a black 17-year-old. Surely he's part of America as well." Goodman agrees with this, and Bowie bluntly asks, "Does it not feel like it's a frightening predicament to be in?" And his response is, "Yeah, but less so here than in radio." And Bowie doesn't let him off the hook for this comment. He says, "Well, don't say, well, it's not me, it's them." He had basically admitted that the American music media had a strong preference. Or the most charitable interpretation is that they were cynically catering to what they believed to be was a racist market. And Bowie then says that surely if this was the problem, the onus on MTV would be to try and change this. He says, "Is it not possible that it should be a conviction of the station and of other radio stations to be fair? It does seem to be rampant through American media. Should it not be a challenge to try to make the media far more integrated in?" Absolutely. I think it's happening because white music and white musicians are now starting to play now more than ever, more than they have lately, let's say in the last 10 years, what black artists have been into. And now, hopefully the lines are starting to blur. And when we play a band like ABC, well, there's white and black kids who are enjoying it, and all of a sudden, it's a little bit easier for a white kid to understand it. Then Goodman says, "The fact is, quite frankly, I could even point you towards a letter in the new issue of The Record, the magazine The Record, responding to an article by Dave Marsh that this kid just ranted about what he didn't want to see on MTV. Bowie spoke over him again and said, well, that's his problem." Goodman then says, "It's not like it was in '67 where you say, yeah, I'm not into that, but you are? Yeah. Now it's, you're into that? I don't like you. And that's scary, and we can't just turn around and go, well, look, this is the right way. We can only teach, I think, a little bit at a time." Bowie was fed up at this point. Interesting. Okay, thank you very much. Does this make sense? Is it a valid point? Bowie simply smiles and says, I understand your point of view. Later that year, a seminal moment happened for MTV. Michael Jackson released his record-shattering album Thriller, as well as the music video for Beat It. But MTV didn't want to play this video on their channel. And the same controversy ensued with Rick James, where MTV saw themselves as a rock station and didn't want to play it, whereas others saw them as continuing to gatekeep black artists. And there are varying stories of what happened next. It was rumored that CBS threatened to pull all of their musicians off this channel if they didn't play the video, but this story is disputed. The director of the Billie Jean video, Steve Barron, has since said, all I remember was that about 2 weeks later, I heard that MTV weren't going to play Billie Jean. They said it's not their audience. And then I heard, and I've heard many stories, that CBS phoned MTV absolutely furious. How can this massive hip-hop record, with a massive video, and a great artist not be your audience? Who is your audience? They said they represented Middle America. I don't think white or black was ever used. MTV were in their early stage. They didn't know who they were, didn't know what they'd become, and they certainly didn't know that Michael Jackson was going to become MTV. Ultimately, this would become a crossover period where MTV switched to playing more pop and R&B music and simultaneously played many more black artists. Prince soon became more popular, followed by Tina Turner and many others. Whitney Houston, who had struggled for years to get her music played on MTV, was now one of its most popular stars. And MTV was not doing them a favor by playing their music. According to Barron, during the early 80s, they were fighting against the thing that built them into the empire they became. In the end, these artists didn't need David Bowie to break down these barriers. But he should be commended for leveraging his power to call out something that he felt wasn't right, disregarding whether we actually know the real reason. Make sure to subscribe for more.